In this video, we'll go over the differences in the needle tool versus the slotted tool for paper quilling. A few things that I'm going to mention here are specifically related to the digital pattern tutorials that I offer, but even if you're not here from the patterns, it will be useful for general knowledge about the difference between the two tools. Many people consider the needle tool to be a more advanced option, and I don't disagree. In my pattern tutorials, I wanted to be true to my own personal style and techniques. It didn't feel authentic for me to make patterns that aren't really the way that I do things, and a couple things that I do differently are that I use heavier weight paper and I use the needle tool almost exclusively, so that's what I demonstrate with. But depending on the type of quilling paper that you're using or your general preferences, you might want to use the slotted tool instead. You can absolutely use the slotted tool just with a couple of variations to get the same results. So in this video, I'm going to cover the pros and cons of each tool, when you might use one over the other, and I'll demonstrate a few ways to achieve the same result using the different tools. First, let's talk about the different purposes of each tool and when you might use one over the other. The slotted tool is easier to use for most. The slot helps grip the paper, which makes it easy to roll. With the needle tool, there is no slot, so you have to use your fingers to curl the paper around the tool. Most people find the needle tool harder to use for that reason, so why would you use it? I started using the needle tool when I started branching out from using traditional quilling paper and started using heavier weight paper like cardstock and wider paper like half-inch strips. You can also see that some slotted tools are so small that cardstock won't even fit in the slot. Wider paper also just doesn't fit. You can find different tools like an extended slotted tool for wider paper, but it's still not ideal. But you can see with the needle tool, you can use any width or weight of paper. It doesn't have those limitations like the slotted tool does. So I will use the needle tool generally when I'm working with heavier and wider paper. I'll demonstrate this more in a minute, but if you're using the needle tool with thinner and lighter weight paper like this 3mm traditional quilling paper, that's when I find the needle tool really difficult to work with. So for paper that's smaller width, like 3mm and lighter weight paper, I prefer the slotted tool, and for wider strips and heavier paper, I prefer the needle tool. Another difference to note before I do some demonstrations is that with the slotted tool, you will get a small crimp in the center of your coils. It's really not a huge deal, and I think that if all your coils have it, the consistency of them makes it all look fine. But with the needle tool, you can get a smaller, tighter center of the coil, and it will have a perfectly smooth, round center without the crimp. I don't think the crimp is the only reason to switch to the needle tool, but it is one point in favor of the needle tool. If that crimp bothers you, you can always use your tweezers to go in and smooth out the crimp after making the coil. So as a recap, the pros of the slotted tool are that it's easier to use since it grips the paper. The cons are that it's limiting. You can't use it with heavier or wider paper, and it makes a little crimp in your coils. I use this one for smaller widths and lighter weight paper. The pros of the needle tool are that you can use it with any width or weight of paper, and the center is small and no crimp. The cons are that it's a little harder to use. I use this one for heavier and wider paper. Okay, let's go over some common shapes and how to use the needle tool or slotted tool to make the same effect. I hope this section is useful in general, though I will be mentioning a few things that relate to the patterns that I offer. First, let's start off with a coil. Coils are one of the most basic shapes in quilling, so you might be familiar, but if not, place the paper into the slot as close to the end of the paper strip as you can, and then start to roll. Doesn't matter if you roll towards yourself or away, however is easiest for you. Your dominant hand is turning the tool to roll it, and the other hand really isn't doing much work. It's just there to guide the paper strip and keep it aligned as you go. When you've rolled the whole strip, you always want to push it off the tool. Don't pull it off with this hand because it could spiral out. This is a tight coil, so you could glue it closed here, or if you're making a loose coil, release it and it will relax a little. Glue the tail closed, and there's your coil. With the needle tool, the hand that's doing the work is the opposite. So once again, with the slotted tool, I'm right-handed, so I'm using my right hand to turn the tool while the left hand is just guiding it. With the needle tool, I'm still holding the tool with my right hand, but the needle tool stays still. You don't rotate it. You curl the paper around the needle instead with your other hand. You could also switch hands and curl it with your dominant hand, but for some reason, this is what's easiest for me. Okay, so let me back up and walk you through that step by step with a few tips. Usually I'm working with heavier paper, like I said, so something that helps is to run the paper between your finger and the needle tool to soften the paper. This is good to do whether you're using heavier paper or not. You can see that it starts curling as well, kind of like curling ribbon, which is just going to get it working in the right direction and make it easier. To get the coils started, I usually start a little bit from the end and sort of back the paper up around the tool. And then once it's tight around the needle tool as possible, I start to roll it. Once you get the paper started curling around the needle tool, I usually get it going just a few turns to get the center started. After that, it can be really hard to keep the paper in line with itself. Without the slot to keep things on track, it can be easy for it to spiral out, and the result is that the center of your coil will be popping out. So to avoid this, I usually take it off the tool and use my fingers to roll the rest. I'm still rolling with one hand in the same motion, and the other hand is keeping the coil aligned so the center doesn't pop out. Same as the other coil that I showed, if you're making a tight coil, you'll glue the tail closed here, or release it to make a loose coil and then glue the tail down. Another tip is that it can be hard to get the coil started, so something that might help is getting your fingers a little bit wet. You could lick them, but maybe that's a little gross. That's up to you. You can keep a damp cloth or paper towel or sponge nearby to get your fingers lightly wet, which will just help you grip the paper. Just be careful not to get them too wet so that you don't tear the paper. Again, all of this is really hard to use for smaller paper. I'm really struggling here. If you've had a hard time with the needle tool, it's likely not you. It's just that you're not matching the kind of paper you're using with the right tool. So after seeing all of this, hopefully that makes more sense. You might find this tool really frustrating with lighter and smaller paper, so use your slotted tool for this kind of paper and use the needle tool for wider and heavier paper. Another thing I want to demonstrate is softening the paper like this. I give instructions in a lot of my patterns to soften the paper like this, or to shape pieces by rolling them between your finger and your needle tool. If you're really set on only using your slotted tool, you can easily achieve the same effect by running the paper between your finger and the outside of your slotted tool. So the paper is not going inside the slot, just the outside. Same thing goes for shaping pieces like this. I show this sort of move in a lot of my patterns, and you'll get the same result using the outside of your slotted tool to shape the paper like this. So you can use your slotted tool for everything, including these shapes, but I will also say that coiling the paper is what's hardest with the needle tool. Shaping the paper like this should be more accessible and even easier really with the needle tool over the slotted tool, so I encourage you to give it a try with the needle tool. One last thing I want to demonstrate is sort of a combo of the two things I just showed to make an open coil like this. So it starts out the same way. For the slotted tool, place the paper strip into the slot as close to the end of the paper strip as you can and start to roll. How much you roll will depend on how big the coil is. I'm going to just roll part of the strip and then cut off the rest. Now with the tail, you might leave the coil like this or curve it in sort of like a C shape depending on what you're making, or the tail might flip out in the opposite direction. So that's when you'll run the paper between your finger and your tool to just curve it in the opposite direction. Again, on the slotted tool, the paper is not going into the slot for this part, just on the outside of it. To make this shape with the needle tool, again, I'm going to soften the entire strip of paper to get it curling in the right direction, then roll the paper strip around the tool, getting a tight start to the center, then just pop it off the tool and roll more by hand. The tail again might stay like this and curve in the same direction as the coil to make like a C shape, or if you want it more like an S shape in the opposite direction, just flip it over and curl it the opposite way by running it between your finger and the tool. Keep adjusting it by hand and with your tool until you're happy with how it looks. These are, of course, just a few of the shapes that you can make in quilling, but rolling coils and softening the paper are some of the most common things that you'll do, so I hope this helps you see how you can get the same results using both tools. I hope this gives you a better understanding of both the needle and the slotted tool, whether you're here for my pattern tutorials or just for general knowledge. If you are interested in those patterns, they're linked below. And if you have any further questions, please drop them in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more quilling tips.